All right. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the May 17th, 2017 Forest Connect webinar. We started the webinar series in May of 2007. So it's been, I guess, 11 years we've been doing this. And we've had wonderful speakers like our speaker today, Dave Jackson. My name is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester. I coordinate the webinar series and other activities of the Forest Connect program. And through those activities, I get to meet really fabulous people like Dave. Dave is somebody I've looked to on multiple occasions. He's my go-to guy when I have an herbicide question. And we've been out on field tours, and Dave is a valued colleague, and I always like to get Dave to give webinars because one, he always gives great webinars, and two, we always get a good turnout on those webinars. So with that, Dave, I'm going to want you to go ahead and start sharing your screen, and then I'm going to mute my microphone and turn it all over to Dave. So thank you all for joining us. Dave, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Pete. So can you see that, Pete?
I can't, but just a minute. There it is. I had it hidden. Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, me worried there for a minute, Pete. All right, so welcome everyone. And Pete, thanks for having me again to do a webinar for you. Let's see, just a couple things. I'll start here with some introductions about myself. So I am with Penn State Extension. I work out of the Center County office, which is right in the center of the state. I am in Bellefonte, but I'm a regional educator with Penn State Extension. I did my undergrad work at SUNY ESF, and I'm originally from New York State, so that's where I grew up at, outside of Rochester. And my brother has land down in Steuben County, outside of Bath, that I get to come up and play on. So some of these things I've practiced up there in New York State as well. So what we're going to talk about today is what I call regenerating hardwood forests, managing competition, deer, and light, keys to successful forest regeneration. And when I started here with Penn State back in 2002, I met with the Penn State forest land manager. The forest land manager's name was Joe Harding. And Joe gave me this idea of competition, deer, and light, or CDL. And I want to present that idea to you. So it's something that I've been talking about for quite some time, and have turned it into a publication and done some webinars and other presentations along that line. So I want to make sure that Joe receives credit for the CDL idea, and hopefully you can take that away as well, because I think it's something that'll easily stick with you. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, we want to clarify that we are talking about regeneration harvests. These are harvests that occur when your timber is mature. So large saw timber size trees, we're talking about the end of the rotation, typically 80 to 100 years of age on our timber. We're making large openings, or large enough openings in the canopy that neighboring trees aren't going to grow and close those openings over, which means we have to get regeneration on the forest floor to replace the trees that were harvested. So we call this the establishment portion of silviculture. So we're establishing that next forest with a primary goal to replace the existing trees with a healthy, diverse young forest of high quality, desirable species. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen, but that's our goal, and we strive to do that. So our regeneration harvests mimic the creation of openings made by natural disturbances. So let's think about what are some of the natural disturbances that occur that would create these kinds of openings that would require regeneration. And most common is probably wind disturbances. So whether it's wind from just thunderstorms, or whether it's tornadoes, which we just had touchdown just recently here in Pennsylvania, they create openings, and our species have adapted those kinds of openings to regenerate in. Now, we also have some other things like insect defoliations or diseases. Fire might even be a cause to create that kind of natural disturbance. And so then with silviculture, we're going to try to mimic those same kinds of disturbances And so when we talk about regeneration, we can have regeneration in two ways predominantly. We can have what we call natural regeneration, which is typically what we think about when we are working with our hardwood forests, or artificial regeneration, like you see here, spruce being planted. And it's probably more common that we're planting conifers. Not so often are we planting hardwoods, although sometimes we do some enrichment plantings. I'll show you some photos here where we planted some oak on a site even. But natural regeneration is regeneration that comes from seed, stump sprouts, root suckers. And so we may have seed that's stored in the forest floor for certain species like cherry or yellow poplar. And of course, most of our species, our hardwood species, when they're cut, they do stump sprout. Key to getting good stump sprouts is to make sure that our stumps are cut low so that the sprouts originate near the ground line. And then we also have some species that are root suckering species. And of course, the one that gives us probably the most concern and the most problems is beech. But we also have some desirable species like aspen, for example, that can regenerate from root suckers as well. So the other thing you need to understand is what we call advanced regeneration. Advanced regeneration is what we look for most commonly when we're managing oaks. And advanced regenerations is seedlings that we find already well established in the forest floor. And if we have enough established seedlings of the right species, that means the next forest is essentially already in place and we can go ahead and take the overstory off. And it's really a key when we're looking to manage oak is that we have well-established advanced regeneration, advanced oak regeneration in the understory. And you see this is one of my landowners here in Center County, Pennsylvania, with lots of advanced regeneration of oak in this understory. So when we're talking about doing these regeneration harvests, and this is a picture of the demonstration forest that I manage here for Penn State, we want to take into account these three things: competing vegetation, deer impact, and light preferences. So competing vegetation, we're going to look at what we have, how much we have, what species it is, how are we going to control it? Is it to a level where we have to control it? Deer impact, what's the deer impact going to be on the regeneration that we're trying to establish? Is it going to be high, medium, low? And then what are the light preferences of the species that we're trying to manage for? And we're going to talk in depth about each one of these different concepts here, and we're going to start with competition. So competing vegetation interferes with the germination and growth of desirable tree seedlings by casting dense shade on the forest floor. So we're primarily talking about competition by shading. So some species can establish so dense in the understory that they completely shade out other species from being able to get established. So what are the factors that favor the development of competing vegetation? And primarily we're talking about two factors. The first is that most competing vegetation are well adapted to shady understory conditions. And so typically in an 80 to 100-year-old forest, these things will already be there and they'll be well established in those understories. So that's one factor. The other factor is that most competing vegetation is not preferred to be browsed by deer. And so if it's not being browsed by deer, they're allowed to proliferate in our understories, and they can become quite abundant as a result of the preferred species that deer browse on being browsed out, leaving stuff that is considered to be competing or undesirable vegetation. So I show you an image like this, and this is in a northern hardwood forest. This is predominantly beech and striped maple, and you can see where the arrow is pointing how dense the shade can be beneath those canopies, where desirable seedlings trying to get established there, germinate, grow, and develop are just not going to be able to. And you see in the foreground there, you see fern being established with a little bit of sunlight coming in. This picture was taken in early June, so the fern is just getting established, and we'll talk more about fern later on. But imagine this in another month or month and a half that this fern is going to be knee to thigh high and very dense, also casting very dense shade on the forest floor. So the lower those canopies are to the ground, the denser that shade is going to be. And we also call competing vegetation, you may see it referred to as interfering vegetation. So it interferes with the establishment of desired species. So you may see that word thrown around as well. So what are the types of competing vegetation? And I list a number of species here. Some of them you may agree, you may disagree. Some of you may think that black gum or red maple might be preferred species, and that is based on landowner objectives and management strategies, those kind of things. But essentially, I list some common species, and certainly in our oak forest, black birch, black gum, red maple are probably our most common competing types of tree species. Northern hardwood forest, you're looking at beech, striped maple, ironwood. And we even have some problems with sassafras because sassafras is a root suckering species, and in some places it can be quite abundant. Some of the other types of competing vegetation include ferns, and we're primarily talking about ferns that spread by a rhizome. These are single frond ferns where they send up just a single frond along those rhizomes, so we're not talking about our clump ferns. So the species would be New York, hay-scented, probably the most common ones, mountain laurel, grapevine, spice bush, blueberries and huckleberries, and then of course all of our invasive plants. And there are many. I think in Pennsylvania alone there's over 70 terrestrial species of plants that are listed as invasive, but I list some common ones here that you would encounter. Certainly shrub honeysuckle, multiflora rose, autumn olive, Japanese barberry, tree of heaven or ailanthus. I'm not sure if you have Japanese stilt grass up there yet, but that's certainly one that we're dealing with here across most of Pennsylvania now, and certainly in central Pennsylvania where I'm at. And then Oriental bittersweet, which is a vine, which I do know that you have up that way as well. And if you don't have it yet, certainly be on the lookout for that one, because that one will cause you all kinds of headaches. So how much is too much? So when is competing vegetation going to be a problem? So we kind of try to make a determination of when we have this stuff. We can determine how much of it that we have and try to make some decisions about whether we have to do something about it. And so what I say typically is when you have any of those invasive plants, if you have any, that's too much. And it's going to be a problem. Just by the very definition of invasive, we know that it's going to spread. We know that it's going to compete our native plants, and it's going to proliferate if we don't do something about it. And then natives, and this number here is based on research that was done by the U.S. Forest Service folks out of our Warren Experiment Station in northwestern Pennsylvania, where they say if 30% of the more of the area is covered with competing plants, then tree seedlings are not likely to develop. And so what happens when you have the ground covered with 30% or more of these things is that following a harvest, they're typically going to dominate those understories once the canopy is open. So we need to talk about doing something to address that competing vegetation problem when we're at that kind of abundance. And so we talk about controlling competition through integrated means. So integrated vegetation management, we call it, and we look at cultural practices, biological practices, mechanical and chemical, and we'll just hit upon some of these real briefly. So cultural practice are things like proper harvesting practices, releasing or thinning around our preferred species, maintaining the seed source of species, not taking the seed source off the site, reducing the deer impact, and we'll talk a lot more about that, planting native species, and that includes planting natives in our yards as well, because they'll spread into our woodlands. And then of course eliminating seed sources of some of these competing plants as well, or invasives, so that they don't spread. So what about biological control? We talk about things like insects and diseases, and we don't have a lot of options there. There are a couple, and here's one here that we are now researching here in Pennsylvania with Don Davis at Penn State is studying this quite in detail, verticillium wilt. of Tree of Heaven, where Atlantis was discovered, and they're looking to see if this might be an option where we can introduce this into forested areas where Atlantis is present and have it only control the Atlantis and not impact other tree species. And so far, it's looking pretty promising. And also rose rosette disease. So this is a viral disease on multiflora rose that's spread by a mite. And this is something that I did discover up on my brother's land in Steuben County. It's quite evident down here through central Pennsylvania. I have seen it completely kill multiflora rose bushes, but at the same time, it seems like every time I kill one, I get another one that shows up somewhere else. So I'm not sure. It may help keep it in check, certainly, but I'm not sure it's going to be the answer to multiflora rose. And then, of course, grazing by livestock is another biological means that a lot of folks are interested in looking at. And I know that Cornell did some studies looking at meat goats in the woods, looking at their control of beech and striped maple understories, that sort of thing. And maybe Pete can talk some more about that if there's any questions. But how about mechanical control options? So we're talking about hand removal, pulling or cutting, things like that. Small infestations, individual stems, learn to identify particularly these invasive plants when they're small, when they're first getting established. And when I'm out hunting or anytime I'm in the woods, particularly on my brother's property or at our demonstration woodlot, I'm keeping my eyes open for these things. And sometimes it's just as simple as reaching down and pulling it out of the ground. Cutting, though, the problem with cutting is that many of these species that are considered competing vegetation re-sprout following cutting. And so cutting may cause more problems than it's worth. In fact, I'll tell you a quick story here. I had a landowner here that was really proud of all the work he did. He had gone through his woodlot and cut all the red maples and all the striped maples down that were, junky red maples and striped maples, and wanted to show me the work that he did. And went back, and all of them had re-sprouted. The deer had browsed the red maples right down to the stump, and the striped maples were 3 foot tall, and he had turned one stem into 4. So I would say be careful what you do with cutting if it's not followed up with some other type of treatment that we'll talk about here. And then mowing. And mowing oftentimes is a first step in really severe infestation because it provides you access. Again, you may see a lot of these things resprout, but this is a fecund bullhog mowing a heath site where we had lots of mountain laurel and vaccinium or blueberry in the understory, and mowing was kind of the first step in the process to try to get this vegetation under control. And then lastly, with the integrated vegetation management, we're going to talk about the chemical option or herbicide treatments. And oftentimes these are where we end up. These are our most productive approach. So with limited manpower, limited resources, limited budgets, we oftentimes come right to the top of our pyramid and look at herbicide treatments. They are effective. We have lots of research now that tells us what we need to use, when we need to use it, and how much of it we need to apply. And we have those studies completed, and we can direct you to that kind of information. They're selective, so we have selective chemistry, and we have selective application methods, which I will show you here. And also low risk. I say low risk to you, the user, and low risk to the environment. So the herbicides of today are much different than what we've had previously. And then lastly, I say necessary, because oftentimes when we look at that IVM pyramid, we come right to the chemical top of the pyramid, because these other methods don't really get us where we need to be in controlling some of this stuff. So control the competing vegetation and then let in the sunlight. And that's what you see in this image right here. This area was marked for harvest, and it was prescribed to treat the fern understory prior to opening the overstory up. And this is a broadcast application. So here's a very selective type of application, much different. This is an integrated approach where this gentleman is using a saw blade at the end of a heavy-duty weed eater to cut down striped maple in an oak understory. And then you actually see he has a backpack on here, And there is the wand right there. So after he cuts this off, he is spraying it with the wand, and this is one of the stumps of the striped maples that has been treated with a herbicide so that it doesn't resprout like I had told you about earlier. So this is an integrated approach, and it's very selective approach too, because the herbicide is going only on the stumps of the trees that you're trying to control. So how are forestry herbicides applied? And we showed you one method there, but certainly there are a number of others that you can utilize. So foliar spot application, so for small infestations of things like you see here, like a patch of fern or individual plants like multiflora rose, backpack sprayer is going to be your best option here. Do not spray to the point of runoff. That's just wasted material. So we say spray to wet or spray to glisten. These types of applications are going to be very effective for small treatments. When you have larger areas, you might need to move to something like this. These are broadcast application, non-selective application. So everything that is sprayed is more than likely going to be controlled, using things like rubber tired skidders or track skidders with mist blowers mounted on the back, or a backpack mist blower like you see that I have over here, treating smaller areas or steep hillsides, those kind of things with a backpack mist blower. Sprays up to 20 feet high, treats a swath 40 to 80 feet wide depending on the density of the vegetation in the understory. Basal bark treatment. So this is another very selective type of application where you're treating thin bark trees, generally less than 6 inches in diameter. You're wetting the lower 12 to 18 inches of the trunk completely around the tree. A nice thing about basal bark applications, they can be applied any time of year, including winter months. And this is a site where we treated well-established red maple saplings underneath a white oak stand to try to get some light to that forest floor to get oak regeneration established. Frill girdle or hack and squirt treatments and stem injections. So these are used to control individual trees, generally over 5 inches in diameter, but you can hack and squirt stems down as small as an inch even, but simply using a hatchet and a spray bottle to frill the tree with spaced cuts, and then spraying the herbicide into those cuts. The cuts must penetrate the bark into the living tissue, so you want to get that cut into the sapwood. Or you can invest in something like this. This is a hypo hatchet. It has a plunger mechanism built into the hatchet itself, and so as you whack the tree, it automatically injects a calibrated amount into the stem, but it can cost you as much as $400 some to get set up with a hypo hatchet, and you can do just as well probably with a simple hatchet and a spray bottle. Now I have ground down the bit on my hatchet, so it makes more of a cupping effect here. Once you strike the tree, you don't want the herbicide to be running out the sides of the cut. So if you use something that had a long blade like a machete, for example, you're probably not going to be creating quite that cupping effect to hold the herbicide, but very selective type of control. Again, the herbicide is just going into the stems that you're trying to control. And then another selective treatment, stump treatment. So used for sprout control and cut hardwood stumps. We know these guys are going to resprout. Treat that stump right after it's cut and prevent it from resprouting. So apply water-based herbicides to the freshly cut surface immediately. For larger stems like you see here, all you're treating is that outer ring of sapwood right up to the edge of the bark there. So what do I use? And I say that for most all of our needs, we can use 3 active ingredients. Some of these might be restricted use, so you need to check your state, but in Pennsylvania, none of these have a restricted use label, which means in Pennsylvania, you can purchase this material and apply it to your own property without certification, but you need to check what the regs are in your own state. But sulfometron methyl, triclopyr, and glyphosate will basically get you what you need for most any of those problems that we've shown. And so here we'll wrap up this section here just with this final image. So I've given you a website here So I have a forest vegetation management website. I have this herbicides and forest vegetation management publication. So if you want more information, certainly go to the website. The publication is linked right to the website. And I wanted to show you this as well. So we talked about the dense shade cast by fern, but look at this well-established fern here and how dense the shade can be under there. This fern was treated here. This is early in the second growing season following treatment. And you can see there's just thousands and thousands of black cherry seedlings that have germinated, just waiting to get that fern overstory off. And so the black cherry has done quite well on this site just by simply removing that competition. So next, let's talk about white-tailed deer and white-tailed deer impact. So selective browsing by deer impacts seedling numbers, seedling species composition, and seedling height growth. So in areas where we have high deer impact, seedling numbers will be reduced, seedling species composition will be shifted towards species that deer don't prefer to browse, and seedling height growth will be greatly reduced. And this is a witch hazel seedling in an area with very high deer impact, and our seedlings end up looking like little bonsai trees in areas with high deer impact. So deer impact occurs over the range of deer density. So that's an important point to understand, folks, is that we don't need to have high numbers of deer to have high deer impact. It's a function of deer density and landscape forage availability. So impact is affected by the amount of landscape forage available. The greater the amount of forage available, the less the impact at a given deer density. So let's say, for example, that we had a landscape with 20 deer per square mile on it, and the landscape was a very high forage landscape. So those 20 deer per square mile on a high forage landscape are going to have very low impact. But if we put the same 20 deer on a very low forage landscape, so a landscape that's all mature forest, very little to no harvesting going on, no agriculture or other kinds of disturbances in the area, those same 20 deer can have very high impact on that area. So we can even have high deer impact on poor habitat areas with 10 deer per square mile. So it occurs over the range of densities, and what the key is that we really have to begin to look at the habitat. What's the amount of forage available across that deer's home range, which can be, as much as a square mile area. So we know, and we can demonstrate it very easily, that deer do impact forest regeneration. And you see a couple of images here with inside the fence. You can see all the regeneration versus outside the fence. And here's another site here. And here's a quote from retired U.S. Forest Service scientist Dave Marquis. So estimates suggest, and this is from their research, that deer browsing is directly responsible for more than 85% of the regeneration failures. So when we see regeneration failures like this, we can attribute it 85% of the time directly to the impact of white-tailed deer. So that leaves 15% of the time there are other reasons involved. So whether it's competing vegetation, whether it's site things like stony sites or wet sites, or whether it's lack of seed source being in the area. So there's certainly other issues, soils, acidity, those kinds of issues certainly arise, but through their research they were able to attribute it 85% of the time to white-tailed deer. And this is something that you can easily demonstrate on your own properties. And I have a number of these small exclosures, and so you can see a fence right here, and you can see all the regeneration in it, and it's nothing but a sea of fern all the way around that area. So it demonstrates very high deer impact. The trees would grow, the only difference being that inside this fenced area, we just excluded the deer. And those fences make some great demonstration to really show you on your property what is the impact of the white-tailed deer, and set those out in your regeneration areas. So what we need to make a determination is whether we have high or low deer impact. And here you see a beech seedling that's nubbed right to the ground, not able to grow above 6 inches, versus this understory here where we see just a plethora of sugar maple well established in the understory, preferred broad species. So clearly this area could carry more deer, very low impact there. So what are some indicators that you can look for on your own properties of high deer impact? So certainly obvious browse lines where everything from the ground up to say 4 or 5 feet is completely browsed away. This is not natural. This should have green vegetation growing in this space right here. Seedlings that are severely hedged. So particularly when we see non-preferred species, so this is a beech, non-preferred by deer to be browsed, but it's hedged. Again, it looks like those little bonsai trees, indicator of high deer impact. And then understories that are dominated by species deer avoid. So let's look at a list of these. So species that dominate where deer impact is high includes things like ferns, hay-scented, New York are going to be the most common ones that you're going to encounter. Grass is particularly what we're seeing now is the Japanese stilt grass. Shrubs like blueberry, vaccinium species, mountain laurel, sweet fern, spice bush, and trees like beech, striped maple, and ironwood. So these species are going to dominate understories where deer impact is high, and you see that in both of these images, these were forests that were harvested that completely failed to regenerate. So there are stumps present in this sea of fern, just a complete regeneration failure. And then this is all blueberry, low bush blueberry, and huckleberry, and you don't see any regeneration in there. Very, very high deer impact when we see situations like that. And here's a quote I'll leave you with here from Dr. Gary Alt. And Gary Alt was our deer management biologist for a number of years here in Pennsylvania and made a number of sweeping changes that we'll talk about here in a minute. But attempting to raise more deer than the land can sustain has been the greatest mistake in the history of wildlife management in Pennsylvania. And I would hate to see other states follow in our footsteps. And I think Gary Alt was right on here. So how do we reduce deer impact? What about using things like our woven wire fences? And this is a common practice across much of Pennsylvania, and certainly commonly practiced on our state forests. So we're looking at anywhere from $2.50 to $4 a lineal foot installed. We just fenced a 10-acre area. It cost us over $8,000. Not the answer. Not a lot of people are going to be spending that kind of money. Plus, at the same time, what it does is excludes deer from really good habitat, which can then compound the problem by increasing the impact on areas outside the fence as well. Tree shelters or protectors, certainly we know that these are used. I don't think initially they were meant as a tree protection device, but that's kind of what they've evolved into because we have areas where deer will just completely browse these. These were shelters that were 4 foot high, and you can see how the top of that oak is just completely browsed out. We had to put mesh extenders on there to give us another 10 inches of protection. So typically in high deer impact areas, you're looking at 5 foot shelters minimum to keep the deer from browsing the trees as they come out of the top of the shelter. The real answer in reducing deer impact is hunting through regulated hunting seasons. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're running into here in Pennsylvania. So back in 2002, when Dr. Alt took control of the deer management program, we made what we call concurrent buck and doe seasons. So for the entire 2 weeks of our rifle season, you were allowed to harvest a buck and a doe if you had a doe tag. Previous to 2002, we would have a 2-week buck only season followed by a 2 or 3 day doe season. So that was the first time in our history in 2002 that we actually had concurrent seasons. So we also began an early firearms and muzzleloader antlerless only season. So we had this early doe season where folks can get out with youth, with senior citizens, muzzle loaders, and they can take deer, antlerless deer only. We also initiated antler restrictions. So we protected about 60 to 70% of our 1.5-year-old bucks. So that went across the state. Those are still in effect today and very popular actually. And now we're seeing for the first time ever in our history that we're actually harvesting more 2.5 and 3.5-year-old bucks than we've ever have. And then we've also had an increase in tag allocations. And all of this was designed to reduce deer numbers, reduce deer impact in our state. In 2003, we also initiated the Deer Management Assistance Program, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But this actually allowed forest landowners, so if you only owned forest land before this program came into effect, we call it DMAP, before DMAP came into effect, you were not able to harvest additional deer from your forested property. Okay, and that didn't come into effect until 2003. So if you were running into one of these regeneration failures, there was no program available for you to harvest additional deer from your property until 2003 came into effect. But what happened in 2008, we started to get a lot of complaints that deer numbers were too low. People weren't seeing, hunters weren't seeing enough deer in the woods. And I'll say we clearly did reduce deer numbers, certainly by 2008. So they set up an experiment where they took 4 of our wildlife management units and they split them into a season that we call a 5-7 split season. So that meant the first 5 days was buck only, and the remaining 7 days was buck and doe. So you couldn't harvest a doe. Even if you had a permit, you couldn't harvest a doe for the first 5 days of the season. You had to wait till the first Saturday came in. And so that didn't last very long. We only had that for 2 years looking at these 4 units, where in 2010 they added another 4, 2011 added another 4, 2014 we had 14 of our 23, 15 we had 18 of our 23 units. And then in 2017, just this year, they essentially took the whole state and they said, we're going to make it all a split 5-7 season. And so they've greatly reduced, except for Pittsburgh and the Philadelphia metro area, basically. So they took the whole state except for our 2 metropolitan centers and split into a 5-7 season for our rifle season. So that means essentially reduced our ability to harvest antlerless deer. Even though they control the numbers of tags they hand out, they still reduced our ability to harvest antlerless deer to only 7 days throughout the year. And so it essentially was a process that allows our deer numbers to increase. And I was just traveling on our highways yesterday across Interstate 80, and it really is amazing the numbers of deer that you do see hit on our road. So clearly these policies have allowed our deer numbers to increase. But we do have this tool. So DMAP is kind of our saving grace for landowners when they don't have the ability to harvest sufficient numbers through the regular seasons. You can apply for DMAP. The landowner receives the permits. They divvy those out to the hunters that they want. They can advertise it even on the website if they choose to. But if they have hunters that use their property, they can give them coupons where the hunter then turns that in for a tag. And I know New York State has a similar DMAP kind of program, but it allows the landowner to harvest additional antlerless deer during the regular deer seasons. And they don't, in Pennsylvania, they don't have to follow that 5-7 split. If you have a DMAP tag, you can use that DMAP tag on opening day, for example. And you have to harvest female deer if you want to control deer populations. And I want to leave you with a great resource center here. It's called Caring for Deer and Forests. If you haven't seen this, check it out. It was put together by some of our U.S. Forest Service folks. So deerandforest.org. Lots of really good information on there that you can learn more about deer and deer impacts on forests and some of the things that you can do. So lastly, on regeneration harvest, we need to talk about light, because light affects seedling germination and growth. And you need to understand this concept, shade tolerance. So shade tolerance describes the level of light at which a tree species is best able to germinate, grow, and develop. So we know that all trees can grow in sunlight, but some species are much better able to germinate, grow, and develop in shady understory conditions. And so we call this shade tolerance. And we list 3 primary classes, or 3 main classes of shade tolerance. And we say that some species are very tolerant of shade. Some species are intermediate in shade tolerance. and some species are intolerant of shade. So if you've ever gone to the garden center and you buy plants to plant in your flower beds and stuff, and you'll see the tags on those plants, it's basically the same thing where it says plant in full sun, or will grow in partial shade, or plant in and will grow in full shade. That's basically that plant's shade tolerance, and it's the same thing with trees where they have different tolerances of shade. So you must address the shade tolerance of the species you are managing for. So when you're doing a regeneration harvest, it's important to understand what's the shade tolerance of the species that we're trying to manage for. And I'll give you a table here, and you see on this table that we have different shade tolerances, and I highlight three of our primary timber species, our most valuable timber species: black cherry, northern red oak, and sugar maple. And you see that they all have different tolerances to shade, where black cherry is listed or classified as intolerant of shade, where northern red oak and all of our oaks basically are listed as intermediate in shade tolerance. And then lastly, sugar maple is classified as very tolerant of shade. So much different characteristics in some very important timber species. So understanding shade tolerance is very important. So imagine if you were an intolerant species trying to germinate, grow, and develop in this situation, where you have just a small canopy gap being created, casting a small amount of sunlight to the forest floor that's going to move across this forest floor throughout the day. So if you were a black cherry or a yellow poplar, or even let's say a black walnut trying to grow in this site, you would have a hard time germinating, growing, and developing here. But let's say, for example, you were a sugar maple. This might be something that you would tolerate very easily, because sugar maple is much more tolerant of shady understory conditions. Doesn't mean you still don't have to address the deer impact and also the competing vegetation problems if you have it. So keep that in mind. So these kinds of harvesting systems, the shelter wood, clear cut, group selection, and seed tree, all let in large amounts of sunlight. So if we were managing for species that were intermediate or intolerant of shade, we need to make sure in our harvesting that we're letting in enough sunlight to favor these species. So let's talk about each one of these here briefly. So the first one here is what we call a group selection. And this is something that you'll see practice in northern hardwood forests quite commonly, where a group of trees is harvested. The group is typically around a ½ acre in size. It's based on, at a minimum, the height of the trees. So let's say if we had trees that grew 60 feet tall, the distance across the opening should be at least 120 feet. We can get enough sunlight into the center of these openings where we can grow species that are more intolerant of shade, and around the edges we're going to grow species that are more tolerant of shade. So your first harvest might be these groups here. 10 or 20 years later, this is now regenerated, and you have, a 20-year-old timber growing here, but your next harvest might be this group and this group over here and this group over here. So it allows for periodic harvesting where you're always maintaining some mature trees on your property as well. So from an aesthetic point of view, it can be quite pleasing that way. Versus something like this, where most folks don't like the looks of a clear cut, but it is a well adapted process for species that are intolerant of shade. So things like aspen, very commonly practiced; black cherry, very commonly practiced. If we have advanced regeneration in the understory, and we already have lots of the species that we're looking for, we can use clear cutting in that method as well, where we're essentially just releasing that advanced regeneration. And then the last one over here is what we call a shelter wood. And this is typically a 2-stage cut, where stage 1, and it's typically or commonly, let's say, used for managing oak, where oak is intermediate in shade tolerance, where we're leaving scattered overstory trees, the best seed trees that we have out there, to produce a little bit of shade, to give a little bit of protection, but not so much that we have shaded the understories completely. We leave that overstory there for 5 to 7 years. We get the regeneration well established, and then we come back in a stage 2 and remove essentially all the overstory trees, maybe leaving some wildlife trees or maybe some uncommon species out there and the overstory. But essentially the overstory is removed, that young forest is then allowed to grow. So these systems here, these are silvicultural systems that allow lots of sunlight to reach the forest floor and are going to allow species that are typically intermediate or intolerant to shade to grow. And let's contrast that with this one. This is called single tree selection. And you can see in this diagram where we're just removing individual tree crowns from the canopy. So we're letting in small amounts of sunlight to the forest floor through this kind of harvesting. And this is a typical harvesting scenario that's utilized for species that are tolerant of shade. So this might be something that we would do if we were managing for sugar maple, where we could still get sugar maple regeneration to establish in the understory. So this, through this type of harvesting system. And lastly, I'll leave you with this here. So this is a publication that I have put together. It's one of my forest science fact sheets, regenerating hardwood forests, managing competing plants, deer, and light. So let's kind of wrap up the whole idea here. So anytime that we're entering the stand to do a regeneration harvest where we're making large openings in the canopy, we want to consider these 3 things: competition, deer, and light. So competition, do we have any? What species is it? How much of it do we have? How are we going to address it? Are we going to use some type of integrated approach? Are we going to use herbicides? How are we going to apply those kinds of things? And then on the deer, what's the impact of the white-tailed deer? Is it high, medium, low? Are we going to need to put up a fence? Are we putting tree protectors around trees? Are we getting enrolled in the DMAP program? Do we need to address that prior to the harvest? Maybe a number of years prior to the harvest, maybe we need to be addressing the impact of the white-tailed deer so that we have some advanced regeneration established on the forest floor. And then lastly, light. We want to make sure that we're addressing the light requirements of the species that we're managing for. So are the species intolerant, intermediate, or tolerant of shady understory condition? And through our harvesting, we're making sure that we're allowing the proper amount of light to reach the forest floor to stimulate that regeneration, that growth and development of those species that we want to manage for. So CDL, keys to successful hardwood forest regeneration. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Pete, if we have any.
Thank you, Dave. To figure out where my unmute button was.
Yeah, I've done that too.
Very good. Thank you. There are some questions. And I like the inclusion of the different silvicultural systems, you know, the group selection. That was a nice way to illustrate the impacts and the consequences of thinking about shade tolerance. So, all right. So Kevin says, and so this is a chance for you all when you're writing in questions, please, when you send them, try to change it so it's sent to everyone. I'm going to be rereading the questions, but it helps if people can read the questions for themselves. And also, before I forget, when you registered for the webinar, you automatically registered for continuing education credits, so you don't need to take any additional steps. I will be sending that out. So we have Kevin says, for forests with a dense carpet of ferns on the ground, are there methods to remove ferns without herbicide?
So the research tried a number of different methods, particularly things like mowing or prescribed burning, and they did not find success with those methods. And so I think your best approach, if you have a dense carpet of rhizomatous ferns, so hay-scented, New York, even bracken fern possibly. Those are all ferns that spread by rhizomes. You're probably going to be looking at a herbicide application there. You can use some selective approaches to that. For example, we're looking at using a pre-emergence type of herbicide now that can be applied directly over dormant seedlings. And so that may be an option for you as well. But typically these are growing season applications once the ferns are completely opened and the frond has unrolled. I do have a fact sheet on controlling ferns where I summarize a lot of this information, and be happy to share that with you if you want to reach out to me.
Dave, I would agree with that recommendation. I'll share a personal experience I had with ferns in an area near my house, or when I was building my house. I had a lot of ferns, and at that time I was raising Cornish rock cross meat chickens. And I had a very high density of chickens. I put them into this fern patch, and the ferns, and so this is like, over a 10-week time span. By high density, I mean probably a quarter of an acre, and I think I was running, I remember that year, 75 or 80 chickens. So if you're familiar with chicken, they start off, they're very small, very cute, but by the end of their lifespan, they're eating a lot of food and everything that goes along with eating a lot of food. There were no ferns came back, or almost no ferns came back. So there may be some strategies. I don't think they're going to be effective. If you're trying to regenerate a quarter of an acre, that might be an option. If you have 20 acres, I'm fairly confident you don't want enough chickens that they would mob 20, unless you're a commercial poultry producer. You don't want that many. You don't want that many chickens. So,
Interesting.
So anyway, I wanted to share. That's one of my favorite chicken stories. I'm not sure anybody else likes it, but I like to share it. So, okay, where are we? All right, Steve says, can you discuss sun scald, especially with maple, when you're looking at things like opening up a section of woods?
So I'll be honest with you, I don't have a lot of experience with that. I certainly have seen it or heard of it and heard of it. I don't, Pete, maybe you have something to add in particular, but we certainly do experience that when species have grown in shady understory conditions, and particularly with maples. Sometimes they can be well established in that mid canopy, and we see them oftentimes even sitting right below oak canopies or cherry canopies and ash even, and then they're released. I'm not sure if they ultimately recover, but we do see some issues with sun scald in those cases.
I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, I've seen sun scald. I've never looked at the research for that. I think it happens, but I don't, in my experience, it doesn't happen a lot. And those are trees that you would typically remove in subsequent thinning operations. It's more common on, I believe, on smaller, by that 3 to 6 or 8 inch diameter trees.
Yeah.
So you'd still be able to remove those during a subsequent thinning operation.
Yeah, I think you're right. So you do see that. I'm not sure, it's avoidable in that regard. If you did have a good quality sugar maple, that is something that has recommendations to leave out there because it is a quality stem, even though it's smallish in diameter. But you may get some sun scald on just because it grew in that shade its entire life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Charles wants to know if you can provide more information on the brush cutter stump spray setup.
Yes, I'm not sure it was an official setup, certainly, but it was just a backpack where he rigged the wand itself onto the stem of the brush saw and held it there. I don't know how he actually strapped it on there, but he was able to work through that striped maple. He was just treating those stumps with an imazapyr herbicide, which we didn't mention, but when we're looking at maples, imazapyr has been shown to be very effective on species, particularly striped maple. There was research done by the U.S. Forest Service on that. So We got to get away from glyphosate when we're treating maples in particular. So he would cut those off. This was a growing season application. So springtime is the time that you're avoiding spring sap flow. So if sap comes up out of those stumps, it's going to just push the herbicide right out. You're not going to be effective at controlling it. So once the tree is completely leafed out, it's cut off and the stump is treated immediately. And he was just moving through that understory, which was predominantly an oak forest.
Okay. Norm says that in his opinion, the most significant, and he's going to want your reaction to this, the most significant deterrent to long-term forest management is excessive property taxes, particularly school taxes. In New York, it varies. We have school and county, and probably every state's a little bit different, but just so in general, property taxes. So
Yeah.
what's your gut feeling on that, Dave?
Well, I can tell you, the first thing my brother did when he purchased his land in Steuben County was enroll in the 480A program through my advice. So it certainly has helped us in the long run to be able to hang on to that property and do the kinds of things that we've been able to do there. Taxes in our state are much lower, but we do have a tax program here that people can roll in clean and green. Some areas it helps, some areas it doesn't because they haven't been reassessed yet. But I think certainly we need to look at those programs in our own individual states and see if that's something that we can do. It's really outside the realm of the presentation today, but there's certainly no doubt that we want to keep forests as working forests. We need to be able to pay the tax bill on them every year, or the use is likely to change to something different.
Okay. Joanne notes that your presentation focused on reestablishment into undisturbed soils. And do you have anything to highlight about reestablishment on disturbed forest soils?
Maybe she could give us some examples, maybe even what she's dealing with specifically. I guess I would say that a disturbed site is certainly a site that's being logged for regeneration harvest. So maybe she's looking at something, whether maybe it's a strip mine site or an old agricultural field or something. Maybe a lot of the things might apply, I would say. But is it Joanne you said, Pete?
Right. So if Joanne's still on, maybe she can add some to that. So one thing that comes to my mind is that you may be more likely to stimulate a seed bank that, of undesirable species, grasses or invasive species that may take advantage of that disturbed forest soil. I mean, if you're adding a lot of sunlight, you'll probably stimulate germination anyway, but
yeah,
my concern. And then with oak and some of these other species, it may be that you get pine, white pine, you may get some slightly better regeneration when you're having exposed mineral soil. Maybe Joanne has a specific question she can add to that.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example too. We tried to do a direct seeding project where we actually tried to burn the seed bank out of the soil with an entire growing season and a half of glyphosate applications. And we planted the seeds in there, and it was just amazing, the seed bank that was still available there in the competition. At that time, then we had young trees trying to grow through it, and we were unable to do any herbicide applications any longer. So yeah, the seed bank can be a real issue in some areas, and this was on an open field site.
Mm-hmm. So Ginger Cop, it looks like she's responding to a slide or a comment that you made. She said, we call that biological control and use that with goats to get rid of buckthorn. So maybe there's not a question there, but maybe if Ginger has that as a question, she can add that back in. James Hamilton says, have you noticed hunters objecting to DMAP because it makes harvesting more difficult, presumably in the long run? And can the fair chase ethical hunting tradition be modernized to the extent of making deer more rare again? How do we, would that be nice? How do we get
not in our state?
Yeah, right. How do we get hunters on board with a program to limit herds to forest carrying capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to understand the difficulties in managing deer, and certainly in our state, it's a very political thing where we are governed by commissioners who are appointed. Our commissioners are hunters, and our entire game commission is funded through the sale of hunting licenses. So it's not the same as in New York, where you have this Department of Environmental Conservation that governs everything from forests to pesticides to wildlife. So it's a much different operation where they're more integrated in their approach to management and much liberal in their seasons and bag limits and things like that, particularly when it comes to deer. And so there's a lot of issues surrounding that. Interestingly enough, we have just this year, the commissioners increased the antlerless allocation as a result of complaints from hunters with an inability to actually receive an antlerless tag. And so, which is almost unheard of, because that means there are more hunters that wanted a tag to shoot an antlerless deer, where a lot of hunters were buying tags just so that they wouldn't get filled in the past. So it's kind of interesting, and maybe we're seeing a little bit of a turnaround there. But DMAP, that's again political in some areas, and there was a lot of movement afoot to try to prevent our state forests and the national forest from being able to even enroll in DMAP. But that hasn't happened. But I think it's a tool, and it's an important tool that we have available to landowners that need to address the impact of the white-tailed deer so that they can achieve their stewardship objectives, and particularly when it comes to regeneration. And if we're going to harvest forests, we need to be able to regenerate it.
Okay. James Baxter says, we're planting trees that they've gotten from the Soil and Water Conservation District. The question is, should we be looking to cut down trees that are 3 to 4 foot trunks? I'm guessing that's height, not diameter. Trees that aren't big or wide, but probably older than they look. So these would be, I'm kind of filling in the blanks, but it sounds like they're interplanting in areas where there's a large established seedling layer of unknown species, and then what those might be doing in terms of competition with the existing.
Yeah, so do we know if those, so they're interplanting in that area, so do we know if those species are desired species, Pete?
Yeah, I don't know, and I don't know if Jim's still on. Hopefully James is still on. James Baxter, he can clarify that question. So I'll go out on a limb and we'll make an assumption that they're undesirable species that are 3 to 4 feet tall, and the soil and water seedlings that show up are oftentimes much less than that. So
right, bare root seedling plantings or something like that. Yeah, so typically we would say, even if it was desirable species, we would probably say to cut them and let them resprout. Oftentimes they're suppressed in understories, and the resprouts will grow much more vigorously. And so even if we had advanced oak regeneration, let's say, we don't care if the skidder runs it over and busts it off, because I've seen resprouts even on cherry and such. It just, the resprouts are a lot better. So I'd say cut them. If they're not desirable, when you cut them, I would treat the stump. So maybe that would help you out in releasing the new seedling, so that you don't have that stump sprouting competition with something that's undesirable.
Okay. Joanne says, so Joanne asked earlier about the disturbed forest soils. She says, our site was logged to remove ash with emerald ash borer. Soils were disturbed to create a road. She's thinking about dealing with subsoils, presumably on the roads, but I'm guessing on that.
Yeah, so the road to me is a little bit different than when we look at the site in general. And what we have done is certainly maintained our roads. So we keep the roads open. We revegetate them immediately by seeding them down immediately following harvest sites. So this is on my brother's property in particular that I'm referring to in Steuben County. We've had 3 different logging operations since we've owned the property. Each time we come back in with a dozer, regrade, reshape the roads, and we seed that down with wildlife mixtures, typically grass and a legume to get quick cover on there, maybe even some annual wheat or rye to get something to green up right away. But we maintain our roads and we use them constantly to access the property for doing our management work or just for hunting or other things. So, and then when future harvest comes, we already have those roads and skid trails in place, and we don't allow them to grow up in trees. Typically, they're compacted, they're disturbed soils, and they're not very productive anyways in that regard. But it will save you from money from having to rebuild or reopen those roads if you keep them open.
Mhm. Okay. So Todd asks, are you getting this awesome oak regeneration without fire? There's looks at least two questions. So first question, oak without fire.
Yes, and I don't remember where this picture was taken. It may even have been down in West Virginia, but I'm not sure where it was taken. But I can promise you this, it wasn't burned, because I don't think I have a single image of an area that has been burned. And I'm the herbicide guy. I'm not a big fire advocate. So I'm not sure that's very applicable for many of us landowners to be setting fires to our properties.
Yeah, be careful with that.
Right.
Now,
So I'm not a burn advocate, so I can promise you this wasn't a fire
yeah.
picture.
And we did have a couple of months ago, Dave Apsley from Ohio State Extension had a talk about forest regeneration. They were using fire frequently, but these were on federal lands or state lands, so these are not smaller ownership parcels. And that webinar is on YouTube, the Forest Connect YouTube channel.
Yep.
Second question, any thoughts on the contributions of wild turkey impacts on the seed bank? You're beginning to see large numbers, winter flocks of 70 to 80 in forested areas in the southeastern New York.
Wow.
And that's something I've wondered about too, is turkey numbers go up, they're out there eating something. So
yeah, certainly. Yeah, they're scratching for seeds all the time. And I've never seen any research published on that, Pete. So that would be something I would be reluctant to answer. I can tell you from our experience that we have probably much greater predation on our acorn crop from insects like weevils, probably more than anything else. And we've even put them inside exclosures or put exclosures up underneath oak and captured tremendous acorn crops, only to have it completely fail and not even see a single oak seedling germinate from those acorns. So that wasn't turkeys and that wasn't deer. And it may have been some small mammal impacts, certainly, but you can see the acorns there, and they're all just destroyed. And if you do some Google searches around, there's lots of things besides the weevil that impact acorn crops. So I would say that certainly all of that has some impact, but most trees are prolific in the crops of seeds that they produce, even if it's periodic, like our oaks might only produce once every 5 or so years. But when they do, it's more than what is going to be able to be eaten by, a flock of turkeys or whatever.
Right. Okay. There have been several people, Dave, that have said they've enjoyed the presentation. So I'm just going from question to question. Ginger clarified, she was responding to my comment about using meat birds to control ferns, and they're using goats to control buckthorn before reestablishing forests, particularly oak forests. And they found that to be very successful if done correctly.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Tony says he's tried to protect individual seedlings from deer by erecting numerous little baskets of fencing around them. He doesn't find that it works very well. The last couple of years, he's laid the fencing flat 6 to 8 inches off the ground around the seedlings. The deer don't seem to want to stand in the fencing. This seems to work better, but it's too early to know. Anyone else tried this? So essentially, it's like a cattle guard.
Yeah. So I wonder if it would be just as inexpensive to tube those trees versus doing something like that. If you find individual trees in their story, to put a tree protector right over the seedling. And that's, when we look at regeneration, and you can see it in this image, we're looking at 50,000, 20 to 50,000 seedlings per acre. Natural regeneration is what we're really looking to get. Protecting one tree might allow it to grow up like the tree in your front yard rather than a nice straight stem that's free of defects and lower limbs. So, regeneration at the forest level is much different.
Right. And so I'm wondering about the use of, Tony describes it as little baskets, and if that's just the best way to describe it, or if I've seen people have very good success where they use a 2-inch by 4-inch welded wire fencing that's 5 feet tall. They cut about a 3-foot section that works out to be roughly a 12-inch diameter tube or cylinder, not a tube, and then they use that, and often with 2 or 3 wooden stakes. So there's a fair amount of effort that goes in. There's the labor of building it, and then there's the labor of installing it, and the number of fences or the number of stakes that you have to use.
Yeah, and don't forget the labor of actually taking it down someday too.
Right, exactly.
And that's the issue I have a landowner dealing with now. But I think you're right. I think there is opportunities for that, particularly when we're looking at trying to regenerate a difficult species, an uncommon species, and maybe it's oak, and where you can find 10, 20, 50 of them per acre that you can cage that might be all you need to protect out there. So there may be some applications there.
Right. Now, specific to his question, I don't remember when or where I heard this, but there was somebody that was using, I don't remember if they were using chicken wire or some kind of fencing around a garden, just laying it out flat, and that was effective at excluding deer. So what I don't know is, if you have snow and a snowpack, probably the effectiveness of that is going to diminish. I'd thought about that and doing some trials. When I heard that example of the garden, I thought about doing some trials. I don't know, one, how you would make it effective throughout the winter, and then things are going to grow up through it, and it would be a nightmare to extract it from the woods 10 years down the road. So the practical side of it is still a question mark for me.
Yeah, I think you hit it right there, Pete. There's a practicality to all of these things, and I think in an area with very high deer impact, there may be some limitations to some of these things as well. And so that's where you need to be measuring and assessing those things, because you can get good regeneration through tops, that lay on the ground following a logging operation in areas with, relatively low deer impact, but tops don't protect seedlings at all in areas that have extremely high deer impact. They're going to get in there and they're going to get them. So it's really just a measure of where you're at on that scale.
Right. All right. Steve says, if you get a vigorous stump sprout from a cherry, can you selectively prune the number of stems to eventually get 1 or 2 good trunks?
Yeah, I think you can do that on most any species, as long as those sprouts are originating from low to the ground, because what would happen otherwise, as that stump decomposes and rots away, a lot of times you'll have a nice sprout down that'll just eventually either have rot in it itself, or it'll break off and fall over on the ground. So make sure those sprouts are originating low to the ground, and select for the best tree or 2 that's on that stump. Mother Nature will do that for you over time, but certainly if you have the opportunity to thin some of those things out, I think there's some benefit. And there's some guidelines there about how they're attached, or if they're attached to each other, so that you don't create a wound on the trees that you're leaving to allow decay to get into those stems. So it'd be best if they were their own individual stems, not connected to each other, that kind of thing, so you're not wounding that stem or opening up for decay.
Okay. And as a little advertisement, I'm pretty sure the December webinar is going to be Jeff Ward from the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station is going to be talking about stump sprouting and stump reactions to sprouting and things like that. Charles says, observation, turkeys have decimated our seed crop of oaks, especially pine cones. or heavy forest looked as though it had been rototilled.
Really? Wow.
Right. Which I've seen in turkeys in my woods come through very sporadically and not every year. And so sometimes they come through and they're in the area, but then other years they don't. When they come through, boy, they do. They're pretty good at scarifying the forest floor.
Yeah, so we don't want to have pigs in our area.
That's right. No,
because they'll be even worse.
Yes. Yeah. No wild hogs. So
yeah.
All right. Well, Dave, that's the end of the questions. I want to thank you in particular, and certainly all of the participants. This was a great presentation, and I'm going to turn off the recording so I don't